Let's talk about isolation. It seems like a particularly relevant subject this year, as all of us have spent some extra time stuck at home in quarantine, and some of us are still far more isolated than usual. Even for me, the level of isolation is rather disconcerting, and I'm the kind of guy who usually spends most of his time alone in his study, reading, writing, watching horror movies, occasionally playing a video game, that kind of thing. I spend a lot of time alone, but even still, it weighs on the nerves a bit when one can't go visit the local pub or see a movie. And that's got me to thinking about isolation as an element in horror. It's not universally true, of course. Some horror does take place right in the middle of a crowded town square. But most of the horror books and movies we all know and love do include certain elements of isolation. It makes a lot of sense from a psychological perspective. Of course, it's superficially true that there's strength in numbers, and most of the killers that haunt our favorite narratives are significantly less scary if we have other people on whom we can rely. Leatherface is scary against a group of kids in the middle of nowhere. He's not so scary against large numbers of heavily armed Texans. But there's a deeper sense in which isolation plays a role in horror. Humans are social animals. Some of us may be less social than average, but even still, we have a fundamental need for some human connection. Why does The Shining work? Because the Torrances are stuck for a long time with only each other for company. Much like many of us are right now. Except the Torrances didn't have the advantage of YouTube and Facebook and cell phones. Yes, there may be some ghosts, and yes, the book is an allegory for alcoholism, so it's not just about isolation. But the fact remains that the horror only happens when they are completely alone. Our need for social interaction, any social interaction, is so great that many psychologists now consider solitary confinement of prisoners to be a form of torture, and they advocate for its abolition within the prison system. This video is not meant to be a referendum on prison policy, but that does raise some interesting thoughts in regard to the importance of isolation in horror. If you want to scare people, keep them as isolated from others as possible. And that, in turn, raises some interesting problems for horror in the beginning of the 21st century. Isolation today doesn't mean the same thing it used to. All of us are now just a text message or a mouse click away from one another. Given that connectivity, we need to think about horror in different ways. The masked serial killer is less scary when one can instantly call for help. The unknown is less scary when all the world's knowledge seems to be at our very fingertips. It seems to me that there are a few possible solutions to this problem. The first, taken perhaps most frequently in modern horror, is simply to find a way to cut the protagonists off from communication. Put them in the woods where there's no cell phone signal. Cut their Wi-Fi. Find some way to keep them from reaching out for help. Of course, this requires an increasing effort on the part of authors and filmmakers, and it's something we all need to be aware of. In the 1980s, mobile phones did exist, but they were a luxury or a novelty. In the horror movies of that time, all the killer had to do was cut the landline. And then, when cell phones became more popular, just cutting the landline wasn't sufficient. We also had to get our victims away from cell service. That's still true now, but with increasing cell coverage combined with increasing communications technology generally, it's getting harder and harder to find a place where people are truly unreachable. And it always feels like a cheat when a horror story has a hero simply run out of battery on the cell phone, doesn't it? We need plausible reasons why they're out of communication, and those reasons are getting harder and harder to find. It's still possible, but it's begun to strain the horror genre just a bit. The second method is sort of an extension of the first. Yes, the victims need to simply be cut off from communication, but in this method, that cutting off itself becomes part of the horror. That's one of the things I loved about the new Max Brooks novel, Devolution. In this story, we've got a group of what you might call techno-hippies at a new luxury commune, for want of a better description. They've got all the tech you could possibly want. Smart houses, deliveries flown in on drones, you name it. But none of them, at least at the beginning of the story, are actually really good for anything in a crisis. None of them have tools, much less firearms, so when they're cut off by a natural disaster, and then faced with monsters, the story becomes not only a fun horror story, which it is, but also a timely commentary on our dependence on technology and our fading self-sufficiency. I'm not going to spoil the novel, and this isn't the place to give a full review, although I will say it's a good book and it's worth reading. But it does illustrate how mere isolation throughout horror's history can be transformed into isolation not only from cities, but from technology. It may very well be that isolation from technology will be one of the defining characteristics of 21st century horror stories. Unless, of course, the third solution dominates. This is the solution perhaps best exemplified by the Netflix series Black Mirror. And it's the complete opposite of the first two approaches. This solution is to subvert the problem completely, instead suggesting that our increased connectivity is itself the problem. I'm not going to sit here and say the Black Mirror approach is the correct one. In fact, I think all three approaches have their place. But I will say this. As much as I love horror, and I do, very little of it actually scares me. Black Mirror, though, has a few episodes that really got under my skin. It may be ironic to say so here in a YouTube video, but I honestly think too much connection can be a very bad thing, and I'm not convinced that social media is doing us any favors. The literature on the psychological effects of social media and instantaneous worldwide communication and constantly being plugged in is still in its infancy. But the takeaway from the studies I've read so far seems to be that we've let a very powerful genie out of a bottle without having the foggiest idea of how to control it. So does that mean that connection rather than isolation will become the defining characteristic of new horror? Not exactly. While I do think that we're going to see communications technology feature more prominently in more and more horror, I think the important theme lurking just beneath the surface is still one of isolation. Isolation specifically within a world of digital connection. Let's face it, as much as we might like talking to our friends on social media, Facebook posts and even Skype chats are a poor substitute to raising a glass with real friends at the local pub. But social media might not just be a poor substitute to real connection, it could actually facilitate even subtler forms of isolation. My favorite episode of Black Mirror is White Christmas. It's the one that really gives me an industrial strength case of the heebie-jeebies. Though the story has, let's say, a lot of moving parts, one of the key elements in the story is that people have had social media implanted into their eyes, and they can block people not only on their computer screens, but in real life. It should be no surprise that this is exactly what happens to one of our main characters, who finds that this technology, intended to bring people together, ultimately results in an even more profound sense of isolation. Maybe that technology will never be a reality, but it doesn't matter, because that seems to be exactly what's happening to far too many of us. People are so invested in their screens that they isolate themselves from real life. So even in a world of communication, isolation is still critical to successful horror stories. It just might look a little different from the isolation we're used to in our favorite horror movies from the 80s. I'm reminded of something Clifford Stoll once said. Now, he's an astronomer, author, teacher, and all-around smart guy. In fact, he even made my Klein bottle. During his TED Talk, he said, "What's society going to be like when the kids today are phenomenally good at text messaging and spending a huge amount of on-screen time, but they've never gone bowling together?" It's a brave new world we're building in the 21st century, and for all its promise, I think one thing is certain. we will still find enough new ways to isolate ourselves that horror fiction will be going strong well into the future. Take care, and stay scared.